Hey guys, welcome back. The book we're doing today is Dune Messiah, the sequel to Dune by Frank Herbert. And with me is my lovely co-host,
Maria, who said she wasn't reading this book. And here she is.
Just as a note to anyone listening to this is the sequel to Dune, but if all you've watched is the movie that recently came out by Denis Villeneuve, then this is actually going to have spoilers for the second movie that's going to be coming out, because the Dune movie only covers the first half of Dune. There's still the second half to go, and then Dune Messiah, which is what we're looking at today. So that's just a note to everyone that we'll probably be saying spoilers for. I mean, we for sure will be saying spoilers for what would be the second movie.
And if you haven't listened to our first Dune podcast where we went over the entire book, then there will definitely, because we spoiled everything in that one, but some of our reactions and comments might not have the full context. But we'll do our best to be as friendly to new listeners as possible.
Yes, and if you want more information about Dune, you of course can go check our previous podcast. So, Dune Messiah takes place, I think, about 10 or 15 years after the 12 years after the end of Dune. And at the end of Dune, Paul Atreides, who is the Kwisatz Haderach, the man who can see and bend space and time through his prescience and his ability to see the future, he's taken the Imperial throne, and he realized at the end of Dune that he wasn't going to be able to stop the bloody jihad that was going to be unleashed in his name on the known worlds. And this book takes place after that jihad is mostly done. I think they say 60 billion people have died from it, which, for the record, is an insane amount of people. A billion is so much more than a million. And one of the biggest frustrations I have with this book is that the mechanisms and detail of the jihad are not explained at all.
At all.
We don't get to see it. We don't really even get why he couldn't just tell the Fremen, no, don't go there. Don't kill everyone. So that's going to be a main issue with this book. But this book starts with a meeting of three of the big institutional powers of the Dune universe meeting and trying to figure out how to depose Paul. And that's the Bene Gesserit, who, now that he was their messiah, but he's not in their control anymore, so they're going to try to destroy him. The Spacing Guild, who don't like that he has a monopoly on spice, which they need to travel between the stars, and a new organization called the Ben Tuluxi, I think, or
Tlaxu,
who are like shapeshifter, who can create like flesh golems and stuff like that. They're actually kind of cool, and they're represented by a face dancer who's a shapeshifter who's going to try to get into Paul's court. And the other main character, well, actually, Irulan doesn't really do anything in this book.
She does nothing.
All right, do you want to explain then more of what's going on with the Paul side of things?
Sure. So Paul has, in the past 12 years, created and the entire time he's like, I did the best I could with the things I was given to create this empire, and he's doing well. Dune is beginning to flourish a little. There's a bit more plant life. He has an entire religious organization built around him that now has government responsibilities. He is supreme leader and a godhead. This is a term that they use a couple times in this book that will be, I think, used more in later books as well. And he and Chani have not been able to have kids. Chani's really upset about this. She wants kids. Unbeknownst to them, Irulan, who has been wanting that sweet, sweet Paul baby, but Paul won't touch her at all. He's literally never. She's technically his wife. They have never consummated nothing. But Irulan is I don't know. She says she just wants to be part of the Imperial line.
She wants that Messiah dick. Let's be real.
She wants the Messiah dick. And she's kind of in love with Paul, but she's kind of mad at Paul the whole time. Him and Chani, their relationship, I have to say, is just as sweet and adorable as it was in the first book. But Irulan has been secretly feeding Chani contraception to keep her from being able to get pregnant, in the hopes that if she was never able to get pregnant, Paul would then be willing to lower himself to sleeping with Irulan. Irulan got upset about this, which made her a perfect pawn for the Bene Gesserits to be hey, you want to help depose your husband? Paul is in this position where he acts a lot, and I find this a really big issue, as if he did not have control in this situation. And a thing that's said all the time is that this is the best version of the jihad that there could have been. And we're going to get into this, I'm sure, but I don't fucking buy it. I don't buy it. This book as a whole is just wrangling with future possibilities but in a much more like what could happen is much more of a center focus in this book than it was in the last book, which means there's way more time spent thinking about what could happen than actual things happening in the book.
So that's what I was going to say, is that essentially this book, and it's actually very short.
It's very short.
It doesn't feel short, but it is short technically. This book is 2 plots. It's the plot to overthrow Paul, which is actually pretty interesting.
Yes.
And then a bunch of pseudo-philosophical bullshit that the characters just spew to each other, and that part is super boring and is actually sort of, I would say, like 60-40, the majority of the book.
I completely agree.
So in the last few podcasts, we've been trying to kind of go through the plot of the book as we go. We're actually just not going to be able to do that with this one because there is so little that actually happens in the book.
I'll give it to you in like 10 seconds, guys. Okay, there's the plan. Like they're going to depose Paul, and they say they're going to use a Gola. A Gola is basically a reanimated body of someone who has died that doesn't have their memories. So they're going to use this Gola of Duncan, Idaho to get Paul. Everybody's like, yo, this Gola is a terrible idea. And he's like, nah, I like this Gola. Aaliyah's like, man, fuck, this Gola is exciting things in me. Duncan, Idaho's kind of hot. Aaliyah takes a bath after a stressful day and then fights naked with a robot. And then Paul and what's his face? Stilgar come in and are like, yo, that was on like level 14. You could have died. And you're naked, what are you doing? And she's like, nah, it's fine, guys. Aaliyah's going through a bit of an identity crisis a little bit. Like, she doesn't...
That part is worth discussing in a little bit.
Yes, and we will.
But also, you forgot the part where Paul is like, oh, I can't deny my male body response to my sister.
Oh, yes!
Which was weird.
Yeah, because also, a scene where Reverend Helen Mohayam were in... she's imprisoned, and Irulan comes to talk to her, and the Reverend Mother's like, yo, I need you to get Paul and his sister to fuck. And Irulan's like, what? And he was like, if this bloodline's got away from us, I need you to cross those two, and then I need control of the baby. And you're like, oh, and then immediately after this scene happens. So I thought they were going to go down this route. Like, Herbert starts, and this was a thing that I complained about in the last book, Herbert starts things that go nowhere. So again, you get this drop hint that like the Bene Gesserit are now going to try cross Aaliyah and Paul. You get a scene where Paul's like,
hey baby,
you know, I couldn't control my male response to my sister naked, my 15-year-old sister naked, hacking at this thing, and then it goes nowhere. It's never touched on again. It is never brought up ever again. But then Chani gets pregnant because she went to the desert and she was like, hey guys, I'm not getting pregnant. And they were like, we'll give you a fertility diet. So now Irulan couldn't slip her the contraception anymore. She gets pregnant. Paul freaks out. Then somebody's like, yo, there is a bunch of the Fremen who are starting a rebellion against you. And Face Dancer comes dressed as one of the Fremen ladies and is like, my father needs you. There's a plot against you. And so Paul, by himself, goes into the desert, goes to this old guy's house. He's got
a creepy dwarf, which was weird. And very much like, okay, this book was written in the 60s.
Who, like, speaks in riddles and is really, like...
yeah, this is a lot of the pseudo bullshit.
And intense, and he's like, I know all the people who are plotting against you. So Paul takes the dwarf out of the building, and then a bomb goes off, like a really bad, a something burner, a stone burner, and it burns the eyes of all that are there. Paul goes blind, but Paul can still see via prescience.
Which is important because the Fremen believe that if you go blind, you can't be part of the tribe anymore. You got to go out into the desert. And he's like, dudes, I can still see through my prescience.
He gets everyone else Tleilaxu eyes, but for himself, he's like, nah, I'm just going to have empty eye sockets the rest of the book. And like Chani's like, and then he turned his empty eye sockets on her, and she's like, yuck. So Chani's pregnant, he's blind, but still seeing and doing stuff. The goal is having an identity crisis because he feels moments like Duncan, Idaho, but other times he feels like hate. He knows he's going to be used against Paul. He doesn't want that to be. The dwarf's like, kill when Paul says Chani's dead, kill him. And he's like, no, I don't want to do that. And then Chani gives birth. Paul's like, Chani's dead. And then the Gola, Duncan Idaho, hate, has a like existential crisis, and then all of his memories as Duncan Idaho come back, and then surprise, that was actually the Tleilaxu's plan the whole time, to get this Gola to turn back into Duncan Idaho, because they'd never been able to recover memories or past experiences in a Gola, so that was actually the plan. They weren't actually here to kill Paul. What their actual plan was to be like, look at this Gola that is exactly like Duncan Idaho. We can make one of Cheney, your wife, who is now dead. Don't you want that, Paul? Give us all your Chome holdings. And Paul's like, Duncan, kill him. And so they kill the dwarf. And then Paul's like, I'm going into the desert, guys. I can't see except through the eyes of my just born child, who also, for some reason, has consciousness and the consciousness of past experiences. And then he goes into the desert.
And that's the book. And also there's a lot of weird flirting between a 15-year-old and a reanimated corpse called
Gola. Who was also like always 30 or 35. Like he was older. He was not young.
So yes, that is the plot. And the reason, and this takes again, that is a description of the events of the book, but imagine that we stopped every 30 seconds to spout a lot of bullshit philosophical stuff about possible futures, and that is the experience of reading this book. It was so slow and hard to get through.
It was painful. The one thing I'll give it compared to the first, because I started this book and I thought, this is it, Game of Thrones in space. I'm finally getting what the first third of Dune promised me. It was a lie. Because it starts, let me paint that again. Listeners, Herbert is a great writer. There are scenes that are beautifully done, that are incredibly engaging, and I will list a couple. The first is the prologue of the book, where it is a historian who has written Paul's story, but through a very critical lens of, this man caused a jihad and is holding humanity hostage. We are not flourishing. And it is one of Paul's Inquisitors talking to him, who's like, nah, fuck you. And the guy's basically going to get killed.
Well, and what's interesting is it's a critical lens he's taking it through, but my interpretation was that the main problem the Fremen had with it was that it was a historical view of Paul. And at this point, they're like, no, you can only have a messianic view of Paul. And so, and I remember you telling me about it, and I read it, and I was like, this is great. We're going to get into criticisms of the jihad. We're going to look at the geopolitical situation, and no.
None of it. It was a beautiful promise that, again, Herbert lays out these ideas that never really get followed through the entire way. And you had it with that. There was a beautiful scene with Duncan Idaho / Hate the Gola and Aaliyah in a thopter. That was really intense, because it was like she was like fucking with his psyche and he was fucking with her psyche.
Aaliyah in this book is not doing great. She's
not. Oh,
so in Dune, she inherited all the consciousness of an adult and all the memories of multiple, hundreds of Reverend Mothers before her. And now that's beginning to cause a lot of instability in her. There's also some weird stuff about like how she needs a man to like. The book is from the 60s and it shows every once in a while, but it is really interesting to watch her start to kind of go a little bit crazy and like unstable. And there's another scene I really liked where she's trying to see far into the future, so she kind of overdoses on spice.
Beautiful scene.
And Duncan is like is trying to like go through it with her, and I did like that scene.
There are beautiful scenes that are beautifully written, and honestly, they're the ones where the plot is actually happening, where people are having actual conversations about things that aren't just internal thoughts. That's where the book really shines, and it's interesting because you feel his strength as a writer in those moments. Where versus in Dune, a lot of the most beautiful moments were the stuff that was happening in the head when Paul first had his prescient vision, when, what's Mama's name? I forgot.
Lady Jessica.
Jessica.
Who unfortunately isn't in this book.
In this book at all. My favorite character. She sends a letter. That's it. When Jessica has her like experience as a Reverend Mother, that was like when she takes the water into her body and has to turn it into not poison. That was beautiful. And here I found that the scenes where the plot was really like kicking in, where people were having like actual, I would say, political discussions about things happening now and not like potentially in the future, were some of the best.
Another thing I did like is that Herbert has an ability to come up with concepts in this world that are just so weird and cool. So the moment that really struck me was when the skin dancer or the face dancer is first going to meet this old bitter Fremen who's kind of turning against Paul. And there's all this weird stuff about like the world and the layers of mental ability and acuity these people have. That's just,
Mhm.
it's so weird. And you're like, how did he come up with this and how does he write it so well? But just because of that, it's still not, the rest of the plot still suffers from being too much
Yeah,
bullshit.
it made it very hard to get through. This book took longer than a lot of the longer books we've read to be able to read through because I would just find myself bored. And then an interesting thing would happen, and my interest would be piqued. And then it would just like smack you down again because we'd be back in that like introspection, dealing with the potential futures, what's gonna happen, all that stuff. And like Will's right, there is a lot of interesting things that come out of. There was a beautiful scene, I think it was in that one, where he was talking that Fremen was talking about when he went on the jihad, and there was a moment where he stepped into a body of water, like an ocean, for the first time in his life, and he came back and he looked at the people around him and he was like, oh y'all, we done fucked up.
Yeah, his psychology was really good. I did like
Oh
the
my god.
underlying, there's an undercurrent of resentment to Paul because he took them from this very conservative lifestyle to now they live in towns, and like those Fremen beliefs are beginning to die down a little bit. And like you said,
Yep.
even his explanation of why he wanted to go off world for this jihad because he just wanted to see a place with water was so fascinating. And again, it's frustrating because Herbert is just a really good writer, but he just kind of goes bullshitty a lot.
And I think that has to do with what this book was. I've heard people say, and I can't find some place that really. So some people like this was published as a serial. After I've heard people say that it was supposed to be part of the next book, or that it was originally supposed to be part of Dune, but it got separated. Like it was a bunch of plot stuff that I think Herbert didn't know what to do with because he felt the need to turn it into its own thing. The plot wasn't enough to be its own thing, so then he injected it with a lot of this introspection and all that other stuff. Like this book could have been a novella.
I think there's a couple of things that would have really helped. One, like you said, make it a novella, make it shorter, cut out a lot of this pseudo bullshit. Two, expand it and have Paul externalizing this trying to fight destiny thing. I know that goes against the whole theme of him feeling powerless, but it is not real to us as a reader that he couldn't just go step left instead of step right. Like we just don't feel it. He also needed to get more specific and granular about the mechanisms of the jihad. Or three, I think if he had told this from a different point of view than Paul and Aaliyah's, like if it was just from the Gola's point of view, Haight or Duncan Idaho, depending what you want to call it, then we can see it from the outside, and that becomes more interesting because we don't necessarily need the details to fill in. But Herbert doesn't really do that with Viewpoint. He doesn't really use it strategically. He just switches between everybody's, which I think is something that it worked in Dune, but I think it works a little less well here. I think there's a lot of strength to switching viewpoints.
I agree. I think giving us more of the jihad, the mechanisms, giving us why, because like Paul kind of has the supreme power. People treat him a little bit like a god. Aaliyah has her own religious like following happening where she's her own little like pseudo religious queen as well. And I don't understand how he can't have just been like, no.
That's the thing. Why doesn't he just say no? Why doesn't he just not buy the ships for the Fremen to go off-world? It's never quite explained. I think
Never explained.
the implication is that if he does that, he would lose his position and die. Like, it would be bad for House Atreides. It would lead to their destruction because there's a couple things here and there.
But then that needs to be explained more.
Exactly. There's even a point where he's like holding court or whatever, and there's a last holdout that's like trying to fight the Atreides or whatever. And he's like, I don't want to unleash the jihad on them, but I need to. And I'm like, why? Again, what? 60 billion people have died. Weigh that against all of House Atreides and even all of Arrakis, and it's not equal. It makes him a not good character if he is willing to make this trade. And that's not necessarily a problem if he is motivated by selfish means. That can be a good conflict of, I love Chani, but I don't want 60 million people to die, and so I have to choose between the two. And again, Chani and him, I felt like there was such a better sense of like, I just want this familial love with her. But that's not really ever how it's framed, and it's too immaterial. It's too internalized, the conflict of what happens.
I also thought, and I thought Chani got fridged a little bit as a character in this
she
book.
Doesn't just get fridged. She gets fridged by Paul, like, specifically, because he knows she's going to die in childbirth, and he does not tell her. He's just like, oh, this was the choice she would make. And it's like, no, that's super rude, Paul.
Yeah, but also like she becomes this thing that needs to happen for this specific future, and so she never felt like a character in her own right. There was a few moments where we got Cheney's viewpoints that I actually really enjoyed, and I would have liked, because she's so central to whatever this specific thing Paul needs to happen, I would have loved to have her involved more as a viewpoint, and she really just isn't. And frankly, I think Aaliyah is not as beneficial. Like, Aaliyah technically does nothing for this plot. She does nothing for this story.
That is entirely true. And I think it's what you said about this is sort of a weird limbo in between two books.
Yes, it really is.
From what I know, she's very important in Children of Dune, the sequel to this. So this sets that up, but she doesn't need to be here.
It's just an odd, like, I think Will's right. I think you needed to be more strategic about the viewpoint characters, because it's literally anyone who is in a scene could be a viewpoint character. 2 seconds later, you're in a different viewpoint, and I'm never really sure why.
I've thought about this because it is an interesting... So I probably haven't mentioned this before. Maybe I have. One of my favorite authors is George R. Martin, specifically A Song of Ice and Fire. It is my favorite series ever. I stand till I die, even though I don't like the television series. Anyway, one of the things he says is that the way he breaks it up is you have multiple viewpoints, but they're limited by chapter to one person. And that's the way that I like to write as well as a writer. I only like one viewpoint per book because to me, there's something so claustrophobic about being stuck in our experience. And other writers like to add more viewpoints. I know that you have said that, you like to have a couple of viewpoints in a book. I think that the things that Herbert gets by having anyone be a viewpoint in a scene in the first book is that you gain an understanding of the world and a lot of those mental acuity gymnastics, plans within plans, you get that. So there's a scene in the first book where they're having like a dinner with like a bunch of the local natives of Arrakis. And being able to jump between different viewpoints gives you a sense of like, okay, this character is doing this. Oh, but this character realizes they're doing this, so they're doing this to shift it around. And this character realizes, and that's something that through one viewpoint would be very difficult. But the downside is that, like we talked about we talked about this, the last third of Dune should not have been in Paul's viewpoint because it makes a lot of his actions more interesting. And I think that's something you lose. So really he should have wielded viewpoint as a scalpel instead of just defaulting to what he normally does, I think.
Yes, and that's what it felt like in this book. Because again, I think you're right. In the first half of Dune, it is used much, much better. I remember, and those of you who listened to it, it took me a while to get used to it, but I didn't dislike it in that book. But in this book, it's used so haphazardly. You change from scene to scene. It wasn't used in a way that gave me, like, that added anything to the story this time around. If you disagree, please let us know why. Like, we might, again, I listened to this as an audiobook, and I think sometimes from an audiobook perspective, you lose a little bit. Will and I were talking about the kinds of things you focus on versus reading a hard copy of the book versus an audiobook. But yeah, it was just an odd book. I liked some of the things that happened thematically. I think it was a little all over the place. Like I said,
it's indulgent is the thing. Like he just was not focused on what story he wanted to tell.
The plot really suffered due to this fascination with possible futures, this prescience, and it also, because other characters were also prescient, but they couldn't see the other prescient characters, because at certain points it didn't feel like prescience, because prescience is being able to see the future, but Paul would also be able to see conversations other people had together.
It's magic with more steps. It's also very plot contingent because, I mean, at one point, the way Aaliyah describes it to another character, Stilgar, is that his vision of the future is he stands in the bowl of a doom, so he can't see out of it. She stands on the top, so she can see above it and to other dunes around them. But there are mountains in the distance, and that she can't necessarily see past those, which makes sense. But what it means is that if the author doesn't want them to know something, they don't know it, and it's not clear why exactly. And I think also, going off of what you said that, he's very interested in the idea of prescience and possible futures. I think he's very interested in the idea of prescience. I don't think he's necessarily interested in the idea of possible
futures. You're right.
Because it's not like he writes like, oh, Paul saw this very specific future and he saw like 101 spiraling out, and then he gives details and kind of flows in and out in like kind of an LSD dream, for example. He doesn't really do that. It's just a lot of like, what are the ramifications of prescience let me talk about the burden of it.
The only time you really got a feeling for potential possible futures is when he goes into the Fremen house of that old couple, where the old Fremen is like close to death, his wife is younger, and they have the dwarf. And because he says like he doesn't remember, like the dwarf wasn't there in the versions of this, like the possible ways he saw this scene playing out, but he doesn't tell you the possible ways he saw the scene playing out. Like the he talks about different endings to the scene, but we never are told what the different endings would be. He just notates the differences between this actual happening and the visions he saw. So like in none of his versions of this scene did he see the dwarf. And that's it. So like you know that there's possible futures, but we're not let into it. Like it would have been such a cool thing to see the scene happen and then for Paul to be like, no, that's not what's happening. Then to see it happen another way and then Paul to be like, nope. And like to pick up at different points, like there's points at which they're the same and then we see it continue, then it cuts back to this point, and then you go forward, and then it cuts back to... Like, that would have been a great way to walk through the chaos of prescience for Paul. I think as a reader, that would have made me much more sympathetic to Paul as a character, to see that how there's all of these things happening and trying to sort reality from these futures and possible futures and futures within futures would have been really interesting, but we just didn't get that. It's like Herbert just didn't want to describe that part. And again, I think that Will's right. I think he's more occupied with the burden of prescience and what it does to you than the prescience itself. And I thought he did a way better job showing you like the prescience in the first book. And honestly, I kind of think something that Denis Villeneuve did in the movie was he showed you a scene with a character that never actually happens because it was a possible future, but it was an actual like scene. And so when you saw the actual way that character is handled, you're like, oh, this can't ever happen now. And I actually have to say, as much as I did not love how the movie portrayed the prescience visions, I didn't think they were like psychedelic enough. I liked that he gave you an explicit, this is a possible future that never happened moment. And I don't think we got that in this book.
I think the biggest problem with the book is that because Paul feels constrained by the path he's set off on, he never tries to fight it. And so as a reader, you never get to see the consequences of what happens if he does fight this.
Fight it.
Like, what happens if he does fight this possible future? We never get to see the backlash of it. And so to us, it feels very like, well, is this the only possible future or not? And I think that could have been made for a much stronger book if at the beginning of the book he decides to kind of try to fight it, maybe even just out of selfish reasons, or like just a sense of like my force of will can change it, and it doesn't. And that would have helped us understand why he feels entrapped.
And that would have been so much more interesting from a reader point of view, because then that would have had its own plot life. You know, as it is, it's Paul being like, these things are happening and I just watch them as they happen, and then they happen for realsies. And so it doesn't feel like a plot happening. It just feels like an analysis of a thing that hasn't happened yet. Where I think if Paul had been actively creating his own machinations to try thwart these futures, because Paul's happiness is directly tied to this big event that he has foreseen and he doesn't want to happen. And it is, and I find a lot of issue with this. He knows if Chani gets pregnant, Chani's going to die in childbirth. So he knew Irulan was giving her contraception, and he was kind of okay with that because in his mind it extended her life. But the reason Chani dies is because of complications due to the contraception that Irulan gave her that made her pregnancy really fucking weird. The babies developed really, really quickly. Her body wasn't able to handle it. And that's why she died. And so there's this weird, like, oh, it was always going to happen. But there's no explanation of, oh, he had seen her give birth younger, like earlier, and she died in that vision as well because of this other reason. Like maybe she was dehydrated that day. There's nothing that makes me as a reader go, oh yeah, Paul, you're right. She would have always died. Like she was just destined to die in childbirth, because there's one thing to see the future. And then there's this one thing to have like this destiny element where like, no matter what, Chani would have died, even in completely separate situations, different years, different health points. Chani always going to die in childbirth.
Okay. So the thing about it is, you're totally right about all that. The main conflict of the story for Paul, and it's not very well laid out, which we'll go into more, is that he wants now to just be alone with Chani. Like he wants a normal life.
Yep.
And I felt that conflict much more in this book than I did in Dune, where
Absolutely.
now he wants a normal life, but he sees this, that if he does that, the jihad will grow worse. His empire will grow worse. Again, through extremely vague mechanisms. But whatever, that's his conflict. And I think throughout, so let me ask you, Maria, what is Paul's goal in this book?
I don't honestly know.
Exactly. It's really, here's what after a couple of weeks of letting it sit, I think what it is that he sees a future where if he stays alive or if he dies, then the jihad and his empire will grow worse. But there is one future where things will get better, but Chani has to die in it. And the thing about this is that I'm inferencing a lot. He never explains that this is exactly his goal. He never explains what the bad thing that could happen is. It's all just very pseudo bullshit, like, oh, the future this and the future that. And that's why it feels so insubstantial. It felt almost like the author wanted to hide the plot twist of what's going to happen later, so he can't have Paul think about it. So we're dealing with a threat that we don't know about. And like, so I know what's going to happen because I know what happens in the later books. And I think it's about like what Leto calls his golden path later on, which if you know the books, you'll know what I'm talking about. But if you don't, but he can't describe what it is because he doesn't want to spoil the future books. So instead, Paul this whole time is trying to avoid a fate that we're not clear on what it is.
And I'm gonna make a comparison to something that might enrage a lot of people, but Doctor Strange did it better in Infinity War, because there was this moment where Doctor Strange was like, I've analyzed all the possible futures and there's one where this goes well, and then he immediately poofs out of existence. Not immediately, but everybody dies, and like you have as a viewer like this had to happen for this thing, for the one way this had to go well was for half the universe to just get snapped. But it was laid out that like there is this one option and this is the path. Like Doctor Strange has seen it and this is the path. And there's never a moment with Paul for me where I felt like that was laid out, where it was clearly stated, like, for me to help prevent a worse jihad, I have to let, and because he does talk about Chani's death as like a necessary thing, but you never understand why. And I think that's a little bit of a disservice, because one of the best things about Dune was you knew a lot of the plot twists before they happened. The entire book had narration, like at the beginning of every chapter, a little blurb from Irulan being like, it was Dr. Yui, he did it, and this is gonna happen, and this is what's gonna happen. And so you knew beforehand, so it wasn't this whole like,
you know, the Atreides from the first chapter are gonna be betrayed and lose. Yeah. And then even later on, I think there's parts where she talks about, Irulan in her histories talks about the jihad and Paul's reign, and you're like, oh, okay.
It was really odd. My girl Chani was just done wrong.
She was done dirty.
And once she gets pregnant, you never hear from her. Like, there's very few scenes that she's in or that we have a view. I think there's one where she has a conversation with Paul, but that's it. And then she's just fridged for the later half of the book, and I did not like it. I did not like that aspect of it at all, and especially because like she is gonna eventually come back as a Ghola.
I think that's like way 13 books from now.
It's a bajillion books from now.
Which
I don't know.
We'll get to eventually, dear readers. So that's a good question, actually. Are you interested in reading Children of Dune?
I'm interested in reading Children of Dune because it was supposed to be its own book. Again, this book suffers from being this weird, because if you look at the rest of the books, they're super chunky, and then this one's like, hello, I'm 8 hours in an audiobook. And so you look at it and you go, what happened there? Well, what went on? And I think Children of Dune is going to have its own like actual plot. Like, this really felt like stuff that needed to happen to make Children of Dune make sense, that he couldn't tack on to the end of Dune and that he couldn't put in Children of Dune. And so I think it just suffers because of that. So I'm choosing to think that this was just not him at his best, and Children of Dune is going to be better, which is weird because I think Children of Dune has way more of that weird stuff that I was not looking forward to at the end of Dune itself. But I think in a weird way, Frank Herbert writes things in such a matter-of-fact, like, clinical way that it doesn't feel really weird and fantastic. Like, as I was reading Dune Messiah, I was like, he could explain a man turning into a worm in a way where you're like, yes, this feels like a...
This makes sense.
Not even that it makes sense, but just it's not shocking. It wouldn't feel absurd. And I think that's his writing style. Not that the thing itself is not absurd. It absolutely is absurd. But I think he writes stuff in a way where he, and again, not that it even makes sense, but he just would write it in a way where it wouldn't feel absurd.
And also, I've heard that Children of Dune is more active in terms of the plot. But the thing about the Dune sequels is that everyone has a different opinion of when the series is good or bad. Like, everyone's like, okay, stop after book 3, and then other people are like, stop after book 4. And so I'm wary of it, but I do want to give it a chance. And more than anything, I'm curious. I'm curious to see if he can recapture some of that
magic.
Magic,
like magic as a reading experience, not magic as in woo-woo magic.
God, yeah. Again, magic with more steps I don't like. I don't think I actually have a lot to necessarily say more about the book because it is just short and
it's so
disappointing.
Short. And it was disappointing and it was boring. I'm sorry to anyone who really, because like I love boring books. Once again, my mother brought up that she could not get past like chapter 4 of Spinning Silver and that it was so slow and boring. And my mom doesn't not finish books, and that's one of my favorites. So like, please know, like if you enjoyed this book and it's your jam and you're really here for that prescient thought stuff, like you can have that. This isn't one of those cases where I think I would say, like, no, you're wrong.
I disagree. My opinion is right, and other people's opinions are wrong. But, let us know how they're wrong in the comments if you're listening to this on YouTube. And if you're listening to this on Spotify or another podcast platform of your choice, leave us a review. They help immensely. We're also, up to 30 subscribers.
30
on
subscribers!
YouTube, so.
Thank you, all 30 of you. I so appreciate you. I was looking at it the other day because it was like 23 like a week ago, and then we got like 7 in a week, and I was like, look at us.
Not doing bad. Not too bad. Our little podcast is picking up speed.
It's going. But thank you, all 30 of you. Our first 30 subscribers. You're great. I love you. Thanks for sticking around. I don't actually love you because I don't know who you are. Parasocial relationships are really weird. But thanks for being here.
Thanks for being here, people. Bye.
Bye.